In all my times leaving after the end of a season, then coming back feeling all fresh and energized, I don't think I've ever come back with a change of heart on something, but this is actually the time when that's happened. Like, on an everyday basis, I tend to question my thoughts and ideas on certain things every so often, but I don't think I've had a moment where I've gone on break and I've come back and I've had a completely different idea to something that I once believed. And I will get to why my mind changed on something, even though I believe that some of you already have the assumption because of the title. But before I get to that, I want to start things off in a pretty old school way by giving you guys a fun fact. Now, apparently, all clownfish are born as males. One female lives with a group of males but only mates with one of them, and when she dies, her mate will become the female. This change is irreversible. Like, that's pretty much what the fact is. And the wildest part about this is, I'm trying to think about all of this and how, it sounds like it kind of keeps a certain level of control, and I just have one question. Like, when does that male's body know to turn into a female, and how exactly does that happen again?
Get ready for the battle of the sexes.
Hey, I just have one thought towards this entire thing, and it's the fact that these fishes are gay. Like, I kind of just have to put it like that because, okay, I can understand they're all born as males and there's gonna be one that's a female and one that's getting given by like one guy, but it dies and the guy that was getting it becomes the female. Like, is it that it's like one of those things where they observe and the dude is like, alright, fine, I'm gonna let the homies hit, but it's only just one homie. And then they like initiate the change themselves to do that, lest the, entire species dies or some shit. But still, how exactly does that happen? Now, fortunately enough, in the caption where I got this entire fun fact, there was a bit that did show how it sort of happens. So it says, and I quote, living in small groups, they consist of a breeding pair and smaller male clownfish. When a female dies, the dominant male undergoes sequential hermaphroditism, changing sex to female. They lay eggs near the host anemones and the male guards the eggs until they hatch. End quote. So, in other words, these fishes is gay. Like, we need to say for what it is. These fishes is gay. How the hell does a male look at a bunch of other males and be like, we need to keep this community thriving? Alright, who's gonna give me a pussy? And in some ways, to actually think that, you kind of look at everyone and you see that the one babe you have is dead and the homies are looking forward to having more homies. And you're like, you know what, I'm going to offer myself. I don't know. It's kind of sweet, but kind of gay at the same time. Although at the same time, it does kind of relate to something that happens with a lot of guys, more so the red pill community, where it's like they'll always talk about how, you should have this one babe and she shouldn't be shagging everyone else, even though this is a woman that gets attention from a bunch of other niggas. But at the same time, they'll be very willing to screw each other with that information and tell them that, you should ignore a woman with a body count higher than 3 or 5 or some shit. And then at some point, when one of the more famous ones kind of drops off, someone else comes up and then decides to screw people over with more or less the same information with a slightly different angle to it. Although, then again, I don't sound like I'm just delivering hate here because I'm supposed to start this season off and this episode off pretty nicely with a lot more optimism, a massive dose of energy, and an intro where I start by saying, welcome to Breaktime on West Side, your number one Breaktime podcast, coming to you from Nairobi, Kenya. The man on the mic is a man who is all about the homies, but is not a homosexual. He's a man who always believed that astrology should have been the study of ass. It is none other than your tall, dark, and mildly handsome man, Sir Denver B. We have got a new season on our hands, and quite honestly, I feel like it's so refreshing for me. Like, normally I have breaks, but for some reason I always feel like when I'm getting back in, it's almost like same old shit, just a different day. But this time it just feels refreshing. I don't know why. Maybe it's just a me thing. Maybe it's the fact that it's been super cold in some parts of Nairobi for a very long time, but there's bits where it's hot and everything, and the weather's been nice for cuddling and shit. Either way, I feel super refreshed. I feel ready to get back into business. And to be quite honest, I can't really say that I haven't missed you guys. I can't say I haven't missed doing content like this, and I do intend on getting back into it because I have some new thoughts and feelings on something that I really need to bring back, or at least, some reverting of some, current thoughts back to something a little bit older, but with a bit of a new twist, which I will get into. But before I get into that, because that's for the main topic, I want us to talk about Zanzibar, or should I say the government of Zanzibar. Now, according to a report that came out around mid-July, they recently banned men from plaiting their hair unless they obtained a, get this, 58,000 Kenya shilling permit. Alright, they banned dudes from having braids and dreads, or at least braids to be more specific. And to be quite honest, I actually find it to be particularly interesting. I never really understood why, but I'm just gonna read the caption, then I can get into it. So, it says, and I quote, "The government of Zanzibar has outlawed the braiding of hair by men with a 1 million Tanzanian shilling fine, 6 months imprisonment, or both for anyone who contravenes the directive. The island's Council of Arts, Film and Culture says the rule is aimed at protecting what it calls Zanzibar's culture and tradition. The council's executive secretary Omar Adam told local media that police will arrest any man who plaits his hair in Zanzibar without a special permit. To that effect, any man who wants permission to plait will be required to pay 1 million Tanzanian shillings for the permit. Adam told the Zanzibar Broadcasting Corporation, and I quote, "Police will arrest all men who plait hair. This is not acceptable by the Arts Council, and there is a special permit for plaiting hair which is 1 million Tanzanian shillings, and we have set that price in order to deter them. Now it is your choice to either pay 1 million shillings to plait or buy a razor to shave." End quote. Adam says many young people in the popular tourist destination have had the habit of braiding their hair, which he deems to be against the traditions of the Zanzibari people. "I don't know if there is any father here in Zanzibar who will take his son to a hair salon. This is not the culture of Zanzibar, and we as law enforcers must prevent this," he said in another interview with BBC Swahili. According to Adam, the law has been in existence since 2015 but has not been implemented. He, however, did not clarify whether it affects foreigners who visit the islands. End quote. End of the caption. Now, when I kind of look at this, at first I was kind of wondering why he'd want it removed, but when you kind of think about it, maybe he's trying to deter the LGBTQ, That sounds like something particularly there, because if probably Zanzibari men are known to have particularly pretty faces and they braid their hair, it might influence some of the older Zanzibari men or just older men to look at some of the younger Zanzibari dudes and grab their dicks and be like, And at the end of the day, you kind of think about it, if there's one thing that a lot of people have been fighting of late, it's the influence of the LGBT. Actually, what I was thinking originally when I read this entire thing was probably they're just trying to deter most of these white women from shagging these young men. Because when you kind of think about it, it's almost like the dreadhead situation that happens here in Kenya. How many of the, white women or just white people in general like chilling with dudes who have dreads? It's almost a thing. And I'm not saying that it's a stereotype that you are to expect it or anything of that sort. It's just that it's something that you see happen very, very often. A lot of times when you're finding a white babe with an African boyfriend, there's a pretty good chance, an almost 6 out of 10 chance, if not 7, that the guy has dreads. So the question that we need to ask ourselves is it that, it's going against their culture, or do they just want a cut in the premise of attracting white women for money? Because when you kind of think about it that way, it's like you're paying for a permit so that you can attract white women, because the white women come, they're attracted to you, they bang you, they probably give you a bunch of money here and there. If they give you a little bit of money, or if you're taking very little money, you do it a couple of times, you've recouped that 1 million Tanzanian, or you bang, a couple of high-class female individuals and they give you that money, and, you clear the fine once and you're just enjoying profits for the rest of the way. Like, you kind of think about it, it kind of seems like a win-win when you look at it from that perspective, as opposed to the whole, oh, if they're pretty boys and the older men are going to want to shag them and shit, which I think is probably a little bit of a stretch. If that's the case, then it's probably the older white men. And if that's the case, and the Zanzibari man is gay, it's still technically a win, because it's more or less almost like the older white woman doing the same exact thing. Although, then again, I really can't say too much about it because I don't understand that culture and I don't know if they're particularly pretty people there. I'd have to go check and find out. But as I ponder on that, I am going to move things on to our main topic of today. Now, while I was on IG last week, I stumbled onto a very interesting clip. Now, it had been posted up by Maurice Madeka, the sex therapist, who I have spoken about countless times. I've done a full part 1, part 2 episode with him. Particularly interesting guy, and it was a clip that he had posted up on his page that was from a podcast that he was on, and he did have some particularly interesting takes. Now, I'm gonna play the clip for you, and then we can get into quite a bit of what he said and my thoughts on it. So, without further ado, here it is.
I can also tell the women, but you also picked this guy because he's good at paying bills. There's a guy in campus who used to be a guy of sucking vagina, left, right, and center. That guy today is not doing as well as your husband. So you picked your husband based on certain
You can't have your cake and eat it.
There you go. You see what I'm saying? When she picked her husband, it's because he was very good accountant. He's going to be a pilot. He's going to be an engineer. You name it. But she forgot at some point that her vagina will be knocking as well. Like, you've got everything going. What about us? Why have you merged us with this guy who does not suck us? And that only comes later in life. When she was younger, when she was looking for that man, there was certain list boxes that she was ticking. He's focused, good husband, potential, good father, blah, blah, blah. Her vagina is last in the scheme of things. And that's why you find most of my clients are between 35 and 55.
35 and 55.
Majority.
The small ones,
get younger
the small ones don't care. Why?
No, it's not they don't care. It's not a priority at that time. She's looking for other things. She's looking for a good job, career, investments, husband, kids.
Okay, particularly interesting thoughts, not something that I totally agree with, but for the most part I actually do kind of agree with him. And I will get to the parts where I agree and I don't agree with him in a little bit, but before I do any of that, let me just start by stating that I haven't watched the full podcast, so I can't really speak to what he was saying before or what he said after. I can only speak in terms of what I heard in this particular clip. Now, from what I heard on the clip, I will say that the guy was speaking a lot of truth there, where he was busy talking about women and having sex, a lot further down on the list, or at least a lot of older women having sex pretty far down in their list when they were trying to get a good partner, and him having a lot of clients that are between the ages of 35 and 55. Now, of course, I don't have access to his client list or anything, but from most of the stories that I read that he posts up on IG, in terms of messages, a lot of them will talk about how they've been married to their partner for 20 plus years, 19, 15 years, 10 years. Like, they've been with their partners for eons. Like, most times it's over a decade, and when they're busy talking about it, either they don't give their ages, or just by the amount of time that you consider it, not unless if this babe got married at 18, 19, 20, probably till 23 years old at the most, that woman is most probably going to be in her mid 30s, if not 40s, or even to push it further into the 50s. And that kind of makes a hell of a lot of sense, because for a lot of women at that time, it's not like the kind of things that they were looking for in partners when they were like 20 years old is going to be the same thing that they expect from their partners at that time. A lot of them are probably particularly doing well for themselves, or they have a particularly good life, or they're pretty used to the life that they have. Okay, so now the question that you'd probably find someone asking is, why is it that someone who's been in a relationship for 10, 15 plus years with the same dude be having more or less the same problems and, would be going to complain about how bad the sex is? And personally speaking, I think it's mostly because they were at a point in time in their lives for a very long time where they were told that the sex isn't really a determinant of anything. The sex comes after. In a lot of these people's cases, you'll find that they were told not to have sex till marriage, or if they were having sex, they were told that, it's mostly about pleasing the man, or they've more or less been conditioned to think that it's about pleasing the man or having kids, and it's not even that big of a priority. So when they get to a point where they feel like they're frustrated because they're not having as much fun, and more so there's more women nowadays talking about having good and great sex and leaving bad sex alone, they probably end up going to this guy and be like, yo, I want to have a pretty good sex life, which makes absolute sense. I think everyone should enjoy their sexual experiences. And when you kind of look at a lot of these women, you actually do start to see that their time, or at least the time when they were in their teens or their 20s, and they were either preparing for marriage or they were busy trying to get good partners or good long-term partners, a lot of them had more or less, okay, I'm not going to say the exact same checklist, but they had more or less a general checklist of things that they were supposed to look for in a man that would determine whether they would make a good mate, a good partner, hell, a good husband, and or even father. And I can even argue that today's women have a very flipped view of that, because what they're looking at, what they're looking for right now is very different from what their parents were busy looking for back in the day. Because when you kind of look at how a lot of women were trying to look for a man back in the day, you find that a lot of them were trying to look for someone with good values, who's a good person, or at least a justification that this person is a good person, so, more good than bad. Then they'd look at things like, how dependable they are, how long-term, or at least how sustainable they can be as partners. Then you can look at how they treat you on an individual level. And then last but not least, that's when you'll find now the sex will come in. Mostly because a lot of women who are, say, between the ages of like 35 and above were mostly brought up around a time where they were told that you shouldn't have sex till marriage. And a lot of them were told that sex is something that you do when you're married with someone or when you're with someone that you love. And a lot of them didn't do it until much later in their lives, when they were already engaged or married, or maybe they did it with someone that they ended up marrying, or they have a very, very small number of people that they did it with because they believed that it was with someone that you were trying to have a future with, that you are almost sure is going to make, a good long-term partner or the love of your life or some shit. And for a lot of them, that was how they kind of looked at sex, which starkly contrasts a lot of what the younger babes today, who are, say, early 30s going back, will probably have as a view of sex. And a pretty good indicator of that is when you look at a lot of women who are above the age of 35, when it comes to talking about sex, they don't put too much emphasis on how good the sex is supposed to be or how good the guy that you're doing it with is supposed to be in bed. That's something that a lot of us younger people are talking a hell of a lot more of right now. Of course, there's gonna be a few people who are much older that will be saying stuff like that, but it's only very few. But now, when you look at today and you look at a lot of the women who are trying to get partners today that are, probably, I'd say ideally around their 20s, but even some who are in their 30s, you find that a lot of them put a lot more emphasis on sex. And that entire checklist of, good person with good values, dependable, sustainable, can provide very well and gives good sex is sort of flipped on its head, with like the biggest variable being sex, where it kind of moves either from either number 1 or 2, busy interchanging with money, or maybe a little bit towards the middle. It doesn't get pushed that far down, but everything else is technically flipped on its head. And you actually see that quite a bit with a lot of women, because you find that a lot of women nowadays will talk about the kind of sexual experience that they aim to have and will tolerate fairly crappy partners, or at least partners that can treat them like crap, provided that the guy is making good money and or is a good provider and the guy delivers really good dick. Like, you can find that the guy isn't what you'd call the most dependable. You can find that he might not be the most long-term person, so he might be the cheating type. and his values might be all up in the place, but if he's got good money and good dick, there's a pretty good chance that he'll have a couple of babes in a chokehold. And it's a fairly normal thing for a lot of babes. Now, you can argue about whether that's something that can be outgrown or not, but it is something that I have noticed with a lot of young women. And you can kind of blame that on the whole fact that, people are having sex before they get into a relationship, almost as like the thing that should show whether a guy should get into a relationship. And the whole sex first concept when it comes to trying to get into some sort of a partnership with someone is becoming a hell of a lot more common. And a pretty big example of that is the whole idea of having sex on the first date. Something that people were sort of against and people would speak against way back in the day, but with couple goal role models like John Legend and Chrissy Teigen who've had sex on the first date and they seem to have a particularly good marriage, it's helped reinforce the idea to younger people that there's nothing wrong with having sex on the first date. And it's something that I've also said quite a bit in a lot of the different discussions that I've had both off the mic and on the mic. And I've always thought that it's been particularly okay and there's nothing too big of an issue with it. Except that recently, especially after having listened to this clip and having a bit more thought into it, I kind of started thinking otherwise. Because I'm looking at this entire lifestyle, I'm looking at this entire checklist that used to be there back in the day, which has almost literally been flipped on its head, where money and sex pretty much come towards the top and a lot of the other things kind of just drool back to the bottom and everything. And I'm seeing it coming with more cons than pros when you actually think about it from a long-term perspective. Because when you kind of think about it, when you have women who are prioritizing a man with means, a man with good sex game, and you're willing to let things like, bad social habits, lack of dependability, lack of good sustainable qualities, and maybe a lacking in values kind of take a slump, you find that there's a lot of women who have a lot of shitty partners and a lot of men who can get away with being shitty partners and doing less than bare minimum because that's what's out there and that's what a lot of babes will accept. Because as long as they can tick some of the more essential boxes like provision and penetration, they can avoid having to work on some of the deeper, more important qualities and values in them, and they end up being subpar and even shitty partners in the future. Because you think about it, if this is a guy that can come through for you, I guess, probably 1 out of 3 times, they give fairly sufficient dick and they're pretty good at being good providers, and they seem to give you a particularly good sustainable sort of life, you find that a lot of women will actually go for that guy and will be willing to take up quite a lot of shit, all due to some wild peculiar belief that that's how most men operate and that's how most men behave. And whether that's true or not true, that one is entirely debatable based on the kind of cliques of people you meet with. But in reality, it just gives this idea that men are supposed to be that kind of subpar, not good treatment, but as long as they can fulfill certain objectives, they're good, which has actually really messed up the dating market for women. You can see that it's also messed it up for men, but I do tend to think that from a long-term perspective, it's actually messed it up for the women a hell of a lot more. Because at the end of the day, because they decided to prioritize sex, because they decided to prioritize this tangible, visible idea that this person has good capabilities of provision, they ended up actually sacrificing a lot of the other things that the guy is supposed to be doing or should be doing. And at the end of the day, they end up with what would be referred to as fairly subpar partners, which could in some cases even push them towards a level where they could actually start cheating. Because when you think about it, sort of like back in the day, if it took the guy a hell of a lot more time to get the pussy and he would have to show that he's a good enough person, then a lot more of these guys would probably at least invest into chivalrous acts, would probably invest into being better men before they got the pussy, because they knew that was how they were going to get the pussy. But right now, they know very well that they don't need to do that. As long as they can charm their way and in some cases even have just, really good earnings and show it, they're gonna get the pussy. So, to kind of conclude all of this, let me just say that maybe sex on the first day isn't as good of an idea as some people think, and maybe sex before the relationship isn't as good a strategy as some people might think it to be. Because when you kind of think about it, now that we're doing a lot of the sex before a lot of the real shit's supposed to come in, you're finding a lot of people that are just good at the sex, or willing to provide something with the sex, but because they haven't had to work on themselves to become better people so that they can get access to the sex, they end up being particularly shitty male partners. And maybe if we did have to be good men so that we could get the pussy, maybe there'd be a lot more good men out here, whether you're looking at it as being just a general good guy or even just being an amazing partner to a woman. Although, then again, maybe I might be wrong about all of this shit, so I want your thoughts on it. The DMs are open on IG, on Facebook, it is at Breaktime, on Westside, on Twitter, it is at Bagaka the D. Thank you so much for listening all the way till the end, and I will catch you guys on the next break.